A long while back on the channel, I made a cherry sour Berliner Weiss, and it was excellent. I really loved it. I truly did. But here's the problem. I've got a lot of beers being brewed on this channel, and I'm now running out of keg space. So I need to clear some stuff. And instead of throwing it on the grass the way I normally do, I decided, what if we could turn this beer into whiskey? So today we've got the little air still out, and we're gonna see if we can make a cherry sour flavored whiskey. Let's get started. Now, first things first, let's clear something up. To make whiskey in Australia, you need licensing and you need permissions. I just want to say up front, we have already done that. We are licensed. We've gotten through all the permissions that we need to do to produce whiskey. So don't go copying us unless you have done the same. That's our disclaimer out of the way. Second part, making whiskey means you need to be making it from grains. And if you're unfamiliar with making whiskey and you've only made beer before, you are like 90% of the way there. Where whiskey differs from beer is that you don't need to do the boiling step. You're obviously not adding hops, and you're just going straight to fermentation before you throw it back into a still. When it's hit final gravity, you distill it through a stripping run first, which is when you basically just run it hard and fast as you can to separate as much of the alcohol from the rest of the liquid as possible, so that the second time you do it on the spirit run, you can actually take dedicated cuts and decide what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep to make your final product. So we already have our wash, which is our cherry sour beer. What we need to do is throw it into the little baby air still, run it through until we've run out of all of our wash, and then throw all of that first runnings, all of that, that stripping run back into the still for the final time to make our final product. So that being said, let's move on to step 2. And here is our wash. Now, wash is basically, beer, basically the fermented product that you're going to be throwing into the still. If there's vernacular or words that I'm using in this video that you're not familiar with, please drop comments in underneath the video, and I'll try to clear all of this up for you. But wash is basically your fermented product that you're going to throw into the still. Full disclaimer, I've already also thrown and done a batch of this through the air still to try and save us some time on this video, because it's not the fastest unit in the world. It can only do so much. But what I can say is that this was a fantastic beer. And if you don't know what this recipe was, please go check out that video, because it was absolutely delightful and excellent in summer. And here's the reason why I think it could make a great whiskey. Typically, when you're producing whiskeys, you want esters, acids, and profiles in it that are from souring effects. You typically would let the wash actually sour up after it's hit final gravity for a couple of days, because those extra acids and those extra phenolics that get thrown out there, once put through the still and then aged in wood, turn into yummy, delicious, fruity, tropical, and all kinds of different flavors. So those compounds, those acidic and sour compounds, turn into really brilliant flavors later down the line. This is already a sour beer. I know that it's lactic acid and it's not super complex, but I still think it could be something quite special. So let's chuck this into the still, and then we can talk about what I think this is going to turn into. Now, I think we can fit about 3 liters-ish into this comfortably at a time. I think I had about 9 liters of beer left. Oh, am I willing to push it to the limit? I filled it up to full there, and I feel like I might be getting slightly foolish. I don't want to puke. I'll explain what that is in a second, but I'm going to tip some back in. All right, just means that we're going to do another smaller stripping run. Let's tip a little bit more back in. Now, the reason I don't want to fill it up all the way is because I want to avoid puking. If you've never done distilling before, what that basically is when the liquid in the still keeps heating up and up and up, it keeps producing frothy bubbles and everything, kind of like when you're making pasta and you fill it up too high. When the heat builds up too much and all those CO2 bubbles that are being created can't pop fast enough, it would just get pushed up and through the column. That's being cooled down. That typically would cool your vapor down back into liquid, and then that just comes out the other end. So all you end up doing is producing really hot wash, or really hot beer in this case, just spurting out the other end, and there's no actual distillation happening. But let's get the lid on this and I can explain how the little baby air still works. Now, the way that a still works is you're basically boiling that volume of liquid, because different chemicals have different boiling points. So if you boil that liquid, different chemicals are going to boil off first, and then that vapor is turned back back into liquid from its gaseous state so that can drip out the other end of the still, and you can separate those chemicals from each other. So when you're talking about making alcohol, you've got ethanol, which has a boiling point of 78 degrees Celsius, or 78.4, I think technically, in a vacuum environment, mind you. And then water has a boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius. So because the ethanol is going to boil off first, it allows you to turn it into vapor, lets that vapor rise up, and then goes through some kind of a coil or cooling apparatus. And then that vapor is cooled back down into liquid and drips out the other end, separated from the rest of the water and all the other chemicals. Now, those exact temperatures are not real world numbers. That's in a vacuum environment, because it's going to change based on the amount of sugar you got in there, the concentration of ethanol, and all the other compounds that are inside that mix, inside the wash. So the way that a baby air still works is it's basically a pot still converted to a really, really small level. We've got a boiler, which is going to boil up all that beer that's sitting inside there right now. That vaporized beer is going to get pushed up and into the helmet head of this thing right here. There's a coil of metal that vapor is going to circulate around, and there's a little fan in here blowing on that coil. And because it's such a small volume, that fan is enough to cool down that small amount of vapor back into liquid so that it can drip out the end of the still, and we can separate the ethanol from the other products. Now, with a pot still, that means you're not going to get perfect separation, and that's a good thing. That's how whiskey, like traditional whiskey, is made. You want those imperfections and those other compounds to come through the distillation as well, because that's where your flavor comes from. If we just wanted ethanol, we'll basically be creating, laboratory grade sterilizer, and that's not the goal here. That's you could do that with a reflux still, or with like a column still, or all kinds of other stuff. If you want us to explain what that is, drop a comment and a link down below, and we can do a whole separate video on all that. Or you could also check out Jesse over on Still It. He has some really awesome videos with all things to do with distillation at the home micro level. Now, that's how this still is going to work. I'm going to wait for this thing to heat up. I'm now going to plug it in. That's going to get the fan going. It's already starting to heat up, and soon we're going to have drips coming out the end, and I can start walking you through the first step of distillation. It's also worth mentioning that when it comes to distillation, beer is typically not something that's distilled for a very, very good reason, and that's because beer uses hops. Hops taste amazing in beer as a finished product, but when hops, and hop oil in particular, go through a still and come out the other end, something really strange happens to them, and you get this really weird, funky, what's the right way to describe it? Not like off milk, but kind of like off milk, kind of like a really bad, old, expired lemonade that's really flat and warm in the sun, and you kind of get that plastic taste coming through it as well. It's something like that. It's a terrible flavor. It tastes awful. So typically beer, no, bad idea to go through a still, and there are people that say that the hop oils coat the still and then you never get those flavors out and blah, 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 blah. You can clean a still, honestly, but yeah, normally beer doesn't taste super great when it comes out the other end of the spout. However, this particular beer that we're distilling today, the kettle-aged cherry sour, doesn't have a whole lot of hops. It was super, super low in hops because it was a sour. The flavors of that beer come from the souring effect. It comes from the bacteria that we inoculated it with, and it came from the cherries that we did that secondary fermentation with. So there's very little hop debris in there to begin with, and it's so old now that that hop character has faded out a lot, and I'm hoping that it's faded out so much that we won't notice it in the final product, and this thing's going to be totally delicious, but only one way to find out. We are now getting first drips coming out of the still. So if this was the spirit run right now, we would be concerned about taking off the first part of the run, which is the 4 shots, which is where you get most of the methanol and acetone and really just horrible stuff that will give you a wicked hangover or possibly cause more harm than that. But we're not worried about that right now because this is a stripping run. So we are just going to let this run all the way through, right up until the drips are coming off very, very slowly at the end of the still. The goal here would be to get to collecting around, by the time it's coming off at like 8% kind of thing, or even a bit lower, I'd be happy with. I'm not super concerned about being mega efficient with this run because this is really just a bit of an experiment. But I am going to keep track of that with a refractometer. So this specific refractometer is geared towards spirits. You might have seen things like this in the beer world for measuring original gravity when you're talking about making a beer and that's before you start fermentation. This one here is geared specifically towards alcohol in terms of ethanol. So this one has a different gradient on it, and it's basically going to tell you fairly accurately-ish between 80% to 0% what the ABV is in the spirit that you're measuring. So I'm just going to kind of put some drops on this every now and then to kind of get a gauge of where we're at. And when we get to the point where, and like right now we're at about 35-ish% kind of territory. When we get down to the level where we're at like 8-ish kind of percent, 5%, I'll turn the still off and we'll stop collecting, and then I'll rinse and repeat this process until we've gotten through all the wash, at which point we can throw all of the clear spirit we've collected back into the still, and we can do our spirit run to see what kind of whiskey this cherry sour will actually make. This is a pretty small run, so I'm collecting in incrementally small glasses, but that first bit of the run is the 4 shots, which is where you're gonna have the highest concentration of methanol and the nastiest chemicals. So I've taken about 30 mils / 1 ounce of that out, which is more than enough for a run this size. I'm not gonna do anything with that. I'll whack it into like a firelighter bottle or use it as weed killer or paint thinner or something like that. It is not something I ever want to consume or put into anything consumable. What we are collecting here is the first cut of our heads part of the run. Now, the first stage of the run is going to have a lot of chemicals like acetone, like think of things like nail polish remover, and it'll present as very like chemically, like a permanent marker. Sometimes there's like potpourri or like fake fruit, like really harsh stuff on the nose, prickly kind of in the back of the throat when you smell it. All that stuff is going to be awful. So what I'm going to do is take progressive cuts, like I'm about to switch this cut right here, with small jars, so that what I can do is make a decision later on when I have more time to assess my options. Now I'm going to get stuck into this and give you updates as the run progresses about what I'm starting to taste and when I might be thinking that we're getting close to that hearts cut. Now I believe we are sitting in the hearts right now. I've got a feeling most of this jar is actually probably okay. Because the other thing I have to remember is this is such a small run. So these cuts are gonna move really, really quickly, way quicker than if you're running like a full size still. But that smells quite nice and floral, and not floral, sorry, fruity, really fruity, like sweet fruity. This one over here just smells like chemicals, so we're definitely not gonna be keeping that. Also useful to label your stuff so that you don't make a mistake and grab from the wrong jars later. Now, again, not to live by numbers, but using this on something this size, on a type of run that I've never done before, is useful. And the reason for that is because I just tested it, and we're now sitting around the 50% ABV level / 100 proof, which means in my experience, we're probably getting somewhat near the end of the run. So at the very least, I'm gonna salvage this because I know that this is clean hearts, and I don't want to be contaminated by the next stage of the run. So at least if I separate this now, I know that this particular glass here is safe. And then I might be able to collect a bit more out from what's happening on this jar over here right now. But that's the aim of the game here. Just give yourself lots of options to choose from later so you don't have to make decisions on the fly, especially if it's a recipe you've never run before, on equipment you've never run before, so on and so forth. Once again, we are starting to drop in ABV now. I'm starting to believe that we're heading towards the tails. So again, I'm gonna salvage this jar here, label it up so that I can keep it separate from that next part of the run. That way we don't contaminate it with any of the tails if those tails pop up and rear their ugly head any minute now. This is starting to come out a bit quicker as well. And by the way, the speed, the offtake speed, does it, whoop, that's tails. Good thing we made that cut. So what I just tasted just then is, and it sounds disgusting, but like dirty old wet socks or wet cardboard. It's a really dank, not moldy is the wrong word, just kind of wet, moist flavor and aroma. It's just like imagine you've left a box of cardboard outside, it rains, you come and grab it the next day. That smell, that's how that tastes. So very happy that we made that cut now. I'll keep running it for a little bit just so I can get more of those disgusting flavors and aromas to explain it to you. But I'm very, very certain now that where we just cut it off was our hearts. What's coming out right now is absolutely tails. Now I'm gonna let this run out for a little bit and then we'll start tasting these jars to see what our final product might be like. We are now finished up. Now, as I mentioned just before, if I was doing this on a larger run and I was planning on filling barrels or anything like that, I would have kept running out those tails and collecting them because there was stuff to be salvaged there. So just imagine there's a few more jars, because this is tails, but there would have been a couple more tails for sure, if you're talking about the ratios of where everything falls out. Now, what I do know for certain is that this middle one right here, this number 3, is 100% hearts. It's sitting on the slightly higher end of the hearts, and what I mean by that is it's a little bit more shiny, a bit more fruity. There's a bit more zest going on in this one here, just by smell alone. Whereas this section of the hearts is down on the lower end of the hearts, and it's got way more of that classic whiskey aroma going on. So it's kind of grainy, kind of musty, which I'm not surprised about because the ABV did drop quite low. But it's just got that classic. It's really hard to describe the smell and taste of whiskey hearts when it's first come off a still, because it doesn't have any of that wood influence or transformation yet. It's quite grainy. Like, imagine if you hold like a pile of barley in your hand, like if you're making beer, and you smell that kind of musty, grainy smell is what you kind of get in here, which is quite cool. And then it's got a kind of a backbone underlying sweetness to it. And there's definitely still a touch of that cherry aroma underlying all of this, that cherry sweetness and aroma coming through, which is quite cool. Yep, I mean, may as well give it a taste. Yep, yuck. That's full chemicals right there. Not as bad as some other runs I've done in the past though. Maybe the cherry is softening that one up because those fruity notes come out earlier in the heads, as we mentioned before. Now this one is the one where I'm on the fence, because it could. Did I just get it on my moustache? Yeah, I did. It could be quite good, and I've got a feeling it is at. I've got a feeling that might be heads as well, hearts as well, to be honest. My God, I haven't eaten yet today. I've been tasting stuff that's just coming off, and it's getting to my head a little bit. I know this looks gross, I'm so sorry, but it's such a small run. This is just for me. Man, that's so borderline. But the thing is, if I was putting this stuff into a barrel, I would absolutely be throwing this in, because I know that the barrel can fix this and smooth it out and turn these higher esters and these higher, more volatile compounds into delicious fruity flavors through that development in the aging process. The question becomes, is that something that I believe is worth consuming now? So let's mix these two together, because I know that they're both good. So we have a full glass of this. I don't know what this is in terms of volume, by the way. I don't think it's worth measuring. It's really, really small. But let's get an idea of what we're talking about. That's quite nice in terms of ABV. We are sitting at, wow, that dropped out quite low. That's 50%. Now this here does taste, I was about to just drink it. It actually does taste quite nice. It's very sweet. It's definitely got cherry going on in there. It's got a graininess, which is quite nice. And if this was going to sit in a barrel, that grainy factor would turn into something fantastic, like a Highlands a Highlands Scotch. It's got a really, really great sweet quality to it in terms of grainy type sweetness that I think would actually be quite delightful. I do think though, in all of this, there is a tinge of that hop character coming through, which is kind of like old stale lemonade, like I mentioned earlier in this video, and that does detract from it a touch. But again, the purpose of today is not to make an excellent whiskey today. The purpose of this is to assess if this could produce a fantastic whiskey on a larger scale if we didn't throw the hops in. And in this case, I really, really think that it could, because that is very fruity in terms of cherry sweetness. There's a little bit of tartness to it. It's almost like a pomegranate kind of tartness to it, which is quite nice. And then there's just layers of like grainy type sweetness coming through after that. I am more than happy to drink it at this ABV. When you work with spirits a lot, you become somewhat immune or like numbed to dealing with higher alcohol stuff. But if you're new to distilling and you want to taste it properly, it is useful to grab a syringe, grab out a portion of it, and then just dilute it slightly with water like we'll do now. So I'll just add in a couple of mils of water, and what you get when you start diluting this stuff is bringing out different flavor notes. So the same way that if you're trying some barrel proof whiskeys in a bar or something, or at a distillery, you can taste it first at barrel proof, and what you'll get is a more robust, heavier, thicker, more intense character. Then as you dilute it with water, you're gonna start bringing out the lighter, more floral, sweeter, and more delicate notes. So it's quite interesting the different flavors you can pull out just by playing with how concentrated the alcohol is in the glass. That's kind of cool. That's actually not even bad just as a white spirit, honestly. This would be quite cool in a cocktail. This would be really nice, and like, I'm a big fan of like a Manhattan. I think a boozier style cocktail, like a more prohibition style cocktail, would be quite cool with this. I think making like something like a Manhattan, and then because you've already got cherry flavor going on in the Manhattan, something like this, like a cherry infused whiskey, would just really make that fruit character pop, and would make it so, so interesting. So what this does tell me is proof of concept works. We have produced whiskey. First time we've done that on the channel. That is, well, we can't call it whiskey because it hasn't been aged in a barrel for at least 2 years by Australian law. That's our guidelines for what you can call whiskey, but it is new make and what could become whiskey. Now, it's not really worth doing anything with this, to be honest. It's such a pitiful amount. There's no point actually aging it. I might just turn it into some cocktails later tonight. But what it does tell us is that this process of making an intentionally sour batch of beer really does make something quite special when it comes out of the still, which might sound obvious because sour mash bourbon has been a thing for a very long time, but pushing way further into the sour aspect with that lactobacillus infusion, controlling it with kettle souring means that we have the ability to control how much souring effect we want. So I could play around with different pHs and then deciding, okay, at this point, I'm gonna cut it off now. Now we can start fermenting it at the next stage and throw it into the still. It will kind of give me different gradients of what kind of flavors that I can pull out by how much I want to sour it. But the kicker that I think makes this really cool is that cherry infusion. So what I am curious to do is make a full-size batch of this, a full-size cherry sour, but not make it beer. Just make the mash element, throw in all those cherries, whack it through a still, and see what comes out the other end. Because I think in the absence of hops and with a bit of time in a barrel, this could be something truly, truly unique. Now, thank you so much, guys, for sticking around and watching this video. If you want to see more videos like this exploring the spirits world and the whiskey side of things, please let us know in the comments down below and we'll start adding those videos into the pipeline. And if you want to get more behind the scenes, get more involved with what videos we produce and what stuff we bring to the channel, you can join our Patreon in the link down below. But please like and subscribe if you liked this video and you want to see more of the channel. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. Cheers. We'll see you next week.